there is another one, this guy, a new guy who came to work. But I'll pause here for now, since we're about to start. And continue. So, once again, welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. The afternoon session is going to be an interesting one. I believe the idea this afternoon is to bring it down and contextualize it based on Tanzania and what we can do in Tanzania. While we wait for the last panelist, sorry, I don't sing, I only tell jokes. Oh, here she comes. Karibu sana, welcome. So, without further ado, I welcome you back for this afternoon session, and I hand over to Dr. Akida. So we'll have a first panel Hopefully it will be about how much time do you need?
We have 1 hour for this. We'll try to go 45 minutes if
45
possible.
minutes, okay.
Yes.
And then we have another last one, and then hopefully we should also have about the same time. So, Dr. Akida, karibu.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first panel session, which will focus on regional dimensions of inclusive development in Tanzania. So in this panel, we have 4 panelists. We have Professor Mark Vout, sitting there on my right, who is the Emeritus Professor in Quantitative Applied Economics at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. He has also been the technical advisor for the Tanzania Human Development Project that we have been working together, ESRIF and UNDP, together with the University of Dar es Salaam Economics Department, and also with technical assistant from the National Bureau of Statistics. We have Sabina Alkay, who you must have known her by now. She was one of the keynote speakers in our sessions in the morning. And then we have Dr. Albina Chua, sitting far on my left, who is the Director General of National Bureau of Statistics. And we have Mr. Fitsum Abraha, who is the Economic Advisor for UNDP. Maybe before, the way we have arranged this panel, we'll have a very brief presentation of about 15-20 minutes that will be done by Professor Mark, and then we'll have some intervention from the 3 panelists, and then I'll allow some interventions and questions from the plenary. And before I welcome Professor Mark, I would like to give you a brief background that so far Tanzania has produced 2 reports on human development. The first one came in 2014, and the second one is 2017, which has already been approved by the government, and soon it will be launched. These reports have actually provided understanding on economic transformation for human development. And the first report of 2014 looked at the insights of economic transformation and how can facilitate human development. The 2017 report focused on the role of social policy in the development process, and especially in facilitating economic transformation. So the central argument for the current report is to look at the social policy, the way it affects economic growth and social and economic development at large. And for the next report, we have been thinking of working on the exploration on how the expansion of resource-based economy in Tanzania can go hand in hand with equitable economic growth and human development. This is important as experience is showing that in most of the resource-based economy, it happens that patterns of regional variations are very common. And this is the presentation that Mark will show us this afternoon based on the data that we have been working on for the last few years. Karibu, Mark.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here with such a distinguished group of both panelists and audience. As Tausi said, the Tanzania Human Development Report has a set of appendices which include some statistical information organized by regions of Tanzania. And so I thought it would be useful to use some of this and to do a kind of preliminary exploratory analysis of the regional dimensions of inclusive growth. The data date from 2015, and by that time there were not yet independent data for the new regions of Tanzania, and therefore the data for those regions was used, were estimates based on the older regions and combining them. I have not included the new regions because they're basically derived from the statistics of the older ones, so I thought it was better. The presentation will be rather visual in the sense I want to take you quickly through a set of graphs because we're dealing with regional patterns. Let's start with the, I hope it is visual to most people. Let's start with the benchmark, which is, let's look at GDP per capita, because that's what people are familiar with, notwithstanding many of the critiques. And the graph is a dot plot which features the regions vertically, and the GDP per capita is listed or measured along the horizontal axis. So horizontal differences between the dots reflect differences in GDP per capita. What you can see is, as you would expect, the region with the highest GDP per capita is Dar es Salaam, which is then followed by Iringa, after which there is a gap where you have about 4 regions fairly close together. There's another gap, and then you have a number of regions that string along the median of GDP per capita, after which you have a tail trailing off to the lowest. If people look at it and are familiar with Tanzania, some of you might be a bit surprised at the ordering of the data. Among the 6 top regions, it's interesting to note that 3 of them were part of what is called the Big Four. The Big Four surplus food producing areas in Tanzania. The Big Four is not a historical accident, it was actually the creation of the agriculture policies during the Ujamaa period, and particularly sprang up during the 1970s as a result of essentially pricing policy in terms of pan-territorial pricing of food crops. As also is noticed is that the Kagera is the region that actually performs worse on this indicator. Let me now move to the next one, which is concerned with the multi-dimensional poverty index, which both reports, 2014 and 2017, have been producing as a result of collaboration between ESRF, the Economics Department, and the National Bureau of Statistics. in this case, obviously, MPI you organize from smallest to lowest because I'm using here the head count of MPI. And we notice a quite distinctive pattern. Again, Dar es Salaam has the lowest head count, followed in this case by Kilimanjaro. And then you have again a number of regions that string towards the median. And you have a tail with Rukwa region at the bottom. So there's quite a lot of variation in this head count of the MPI. It varies from around 12-13% in Dar es Salaam up to over 65% in Rukwa region. So there's a lot of variation in that index. Yeah. As was explained admirably this morning, the MPI is actually the product of a head count and intensity of poverty among the poor. And I mapped both of them out. So the vertical axis has the intensity, the average intensity of poverty among the poor, and the horizontal axis has the head count. Not surprisingly, the two indicators go together, in a sense have a positive relation. The higher the head count, there tend to be also a higher average intensity of poverty. Although there is reasonable, considerable variation around that trend. Some regions with similar head counts have very different intensities and vice versa. Dar es Salaam and Kilimanjaro, again, among the lower ones in the, both in relation to the intensity as well as the head count. How then does the head count, using the head count because it's in many ways easier to interpret because it's a percentage of the population, of the MPI compare with the GDP per capita in Tanzania? As you can see, there is a relationship, there is a correlation between them. As the GDP per capita increases, the head count of poverty declines. But there is also considerable variation, which makes the point which has been stressed, and I do not want to repeat it further here, that GDP doesn't capture all dimensions of poverty. That there's a lot of variation at different levels of GDP given the head count. Notice, for example, the position of Kilimanjaro is well below the scatter, doing better than one would predict, while Iringa is above the thing, has a higher head count of poverty than its income would suggest. Dar es Salaam, again, is outlying on the right-hand side. Looking at these patterns made me think about both the position of Dar es Salaam in all this, because people who are familiar with Dar es Salaam, on the one hand, yes, you would expect poverty to be lower. On the other hand, a lot of research, including field-based research by people within Dar es Salaam, indicate that there is quite some poverty in Dar es Salaam that, that need to, so why isn't this showing up? So that made me think about it. And earlier today, there was a lot of talk about demographic factors, but a particular focus on population growth. What I'm going to do is to look at another aspect of demography, which plays a major role if you want to understand regional differentiation in Tanzania. The underlying idea is as follows, that socioeconomic change and transformation, and particularly in its spatial dimension, invariably goes together with movements of population. Socioeconomic change affects population dynamic, not only its growth, but also its movement. And not just how many move, but who moves? So this led me to inquire about the age structure of different regions in Tanzania. In particular, the relationship between the share of working population in the total regional population. That's why I selected the statistic of the share of population between 15 to 64 by region. And the remarkable thing is Dar es Salaam sticks out enormously in this list. And actually it varies a lot, the percentage of population of 14 to 64. It is very low, relatively speaking, for example, in Mara region, where it is 47%, more or less. So 53% are children, mainly children, or the elderly. The majority of countries, of regions, lie below 55%. So like Kilimanjaro, Arusha, Mtwara are more above 50%, the remainder being the elderly and children. Dar es Salaam, however, is a big exception. In Dar es Salaam, 2/3 of the population is of working age. Only 1/3 of the population is children or the elderly. Not only that, Dar es Salaam has the lowest percentage of elderly in the whole of all regions in Tanzania. The elderly in Dar es Salaam is only 2.5% of the population. The average for Tanzania is about 4% of the population. The highest is Kilimanjaro with 7% of the population. There's enormous variation in that. So the variation also in the percentage of children is then the residual of this. So what is so peculiar about Dar es Salaam? Well, here is the population distribution of Dar es Salaam region. If you look at that population distribution, it isn't your typical pyramid that you expect for a country like Tanzania with high fertility. In fact, the Dar es Salaam population pyramid has an enormous bulge in the middle. And that bulge starts roughly at the ages of 15 to 19, 25 to 20 to 29, 30 to 34. So you have a bulging. Incidentally, the bulging is different depending on the gender. In the sense, the bulging starts earlier and more significant for women than it does for men. In other words, in the age group of 15 to 19, the composition for women is higher than for men. My guess is that the reason is the inflow of domestic workers into Dar es Salaam. People often neglect that in Dar es Salaam, the largest employment sector is domestic work at home. And that is essentially mostly teenage girls being imported from the rural areas. For men, it tends to be a bit later. It's mainly the 20 to 34. So a distinctive feature of Dar es Salaam is that a great part of its population is essentially concentrated between the ages between 15 and 35, give or take a bit more. In Dar es Salaam, when you're 40, you're old. And that's roughly the reality of Dar es Salaam. But there are, relatively speaking, also fewer children. One of the implications of this is that the dependency ratio in Dar es Salaam is much lower than in any of the other regions. The dependency ratio is the ratio of dependents, usually seen to be children and the elderly, to the population of working age. Now that has implications, and actually I think it has implications for not just for how you think about poverty, but also how you think about GDP and GDP measures. Let me first, however, show you the median age by region, which again is enormously varied in Tanzania. The median age, that is the age at which 50% of the population is less than that age and 50% is more. The median age in Tanzania varies enormously across region. Rukwa has a median age of less than 15. Meaning you reach the medium already before you hit 15 years old. Yeah? Dar es Salaam has the highest with 23. Yeah? Not because there are many old people in Dar es Salaam, but basically because of the bulk of the influx of youth into Dar es Salaam. And Dar es Salaam is continuously being fed with the influx of youth. And that is what makes that particular population structure. So you see, Mtwara, interestingly, is the next one in line in terms of median age. But there's enormous variation, ranging from about slightly more than 14 up to 23 years old in terms of median age. On average, low, but with enormous variation among regions. The implication is, of all this, is that the dependency ratio, as I said, varies enormously regionally. And in some ways, that's not surprising. You know, basically, people move in relation to socio-economic transformations. And it's always important to look at the spatial dimensions of, you know, socio-economic transformations. These dimensions can be create greater distances between regions, make some regions much better off than others, or they may create more closer moving together. For example, I showed you earlier with the GDP per capita that among the 6 top GDP per capita, 3 of them were the Big Four. What was the Big Four? The Big Four, people think sometimes that was traditional in Tanzania, that these 4 regions were surplus producing areas. That's not the case. That was not the case in the 60s. Iringa, yes, but not Mbeya or Ruvuma or Rukwa. The Big Four was a creation of a policy of Ujamaa during the 1970s. And Phil Rakes, who used to be an economist doing fieldwork in Tanzania at the time, used to say, Ujamaa agriculture policy made many mistakes, expensive mistakes. But it had one expensive success, and that was the pan-territorial pricing of food crops, which led to the development of the Big Four and actually restructured regional production of food in Tanzania quite dramatically. An effect that you see up to today, long after the policy was completely abandoned in the 1980s, but the momentum was there. An interesting way of looking at this is, I took 2 measures. Take the GDP per capita on the vertical axis and take GDP per working population on the horizontal axis. In other words, divide the GDP per capita by the share of working population in total population. What you then see is that most regions line up quite well. Some are above the line, meaning having a more favorable dependency ratio, some below the line. The one outlier is Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam has a GDP per capita which is well above its position in relation to GDP per working age. The reason is that Dar es Salaam has such a large percentage of working age people. The other thing is also that Dar es Salaam's GDP per capita is not all that exceptional. Actually, Iringa has a higher GDP per working population than Dar es Salaam. And Dar es Salaam's GDP per working population is similar to Ruvuma, Kilimanjaro, and so on. It throws quite a different light once you start taking into account population dimension. Here is then the relationship between the headcount of MPI and just the proportion of the population which is of working age. What it shows is that in some ways MPI is quite the share of the working population in total population, across region is quite a good predictor of what happens to the poverty in a region. I'm not positing any causal relation. What I'm saying is that poverty and the share, and the age distribution of population are jointly determined by process of social transformation that either pulls people out of regions, particularly the young, or, pulls them into other regions. In this chart, again, Kilimanjaro comes out as the only real outlier within that. The rest of the scatter goes in the same direction. What does this mean, this brief exploration? This was just trying to come to grips. What do these data that we have at the moment, which are still fairly rudimentary and it's fairly preliminary, what does that tell us? And one of the things it tells us is that, there is a lot of regional variation. Regional variation both economically and socially. And that variation then also reflects itself and kind of interacts with population structure. Not just population growth, not just how many move, but also the age distribution. Interestingly, in Tanzania, unlike in some other parts, in other countries, it doesn't affect the gender balance so much. It's not like, for example, more men immigrate. The sex ratio between men and women in Dar es Salaam is not exceptional at all. It is slightly above the average. It's about 96, which is typical for most regions. So in Dar es Salaam you don't have, or in Tanzania you don't have sharp differences. There is some variation in the sex ratio, but not of the same order. So what are the lessons one could draw in terms of thinking about regional policy? First of all, I think at national level, it's quite important that resource-intensive transformation has spatial implications, and it's important to take account of these spatial implications because they influence the way people move, who is left behind, and what the structures of livelihood is. These data still hide one phenomenon that has not been sufficiently investigated in Tanzania. A lot of migration of Tanzania is not just rural to urban, it's intra-rural and intra-regional. A lot of people move. It is not the case that in Tanzania an attachment to land means one is agricultural producer. There is a lot of activities in rural areas, whether it is informal mining, which absorbs a lot of things, or construction, which involves all forms of work. It's not the case that this is all self-employment. We have a certain way of defining wage employment as formal wage employment. A lot of it is actually the sale of labor services under fairly precarious conditions. But it does happen, and these things form part of the process of transformation. It is indeed the case that the informal sector is very dominant in Tanzania, but that informal sector is both rural and urbanly structured. So for policies at national level, one needs to take account of the regional effects of social transformation. At regional level, I would say that regional strategies and policies need to take into account of the specific configuration of the region in terms of kind of its relative weaknesses and strength in terms of its economic and social characteristic, but also in terms of its population dynamics. Thank you very much. That's all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Markwout. From the presentation, we have seen a distinct feature of regional variation in Tanzania. And maybe I would like to hear very briefly from Professor Sabina Alkaya, What is your experience using the MPI as a vehicle for understanding regional variation within a country, and also for aiding formulation of regional specific development policies and strategies?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. No, it was a fascinating presentation, very clear and very systematic. And I think I just have 4 responses both to the question and to the presentation. The first is that the presentation very importantly drew out the importance of demography. And when we are looking at changes in poverty over time, this issue of both the age structure of the population, the labor structure, and internal migration, external migration are invisible in the numbers that we trace. And so they have to be assessed and analyzed independently. But a lot of the action is happening in the changes and movements of people, or the demographic changes. And so it's splendid that this is already, in a sense, under consideration. And if there are surveys that also can capture what kind of migration it was, then we can go into more depth. I think a second point is that something that you raised about the age structure also draws attention perhaps to the people under 15, or perhaps children who by UNICEF definition are 0 to 17. And an MPI can be disaggregated by any variable for which the survey is representative. And so one of those is age. And I think most of the national MPIs now are disaggregated by age. And most of them find higher rates of poverty among the children than among adults, even when it is a measure that doesn't have that many child-specific variables. So I'll give an example of the global MPI, which has a variable of if the child is attending school until it completes class 8. It has a variable of child undernutrition. And in terms of living in a risky environment, there is also information about very sad past deaths of children in that household. And when we disaggregate the global MPI, this was done in 2017, where we had 103 countries and 5.4 billion people. Overall, 26.5% of people are multidimensionally poor at the global level, which is, in that year, 1.46 billion. It's come down a bit. In the winter update, we update every 6 months. But of those people, 48% were children. 689 million were children. And in sub-Saharan Africa, 2/3 of children were MPI poor, and a higher rate than any other region. And so I think it's useful to be able to shine a light on different groups of the population and have a general sense, very much like the World Bank disaggregated the $1.90 figures in October 2016, and they also found a much higher rate and level of child poverty using that household measure. An adaptation which some countries have done, in Panama, Nepal, other national MPIs are among them, is to have a chapter of their national MPI which then focuses in on children or on the elderly, the 2 groups that you mentioned, and has a linked measure to the national MPI, but with some extra variables for that younger population. And so I think no measure is perfect, and you don't, if it's too complex, then it ceases to be useful if there are too many indices. But trying to look at variation among the age groups is useful. Coming finally to the issue of regional strategies, already in the morning I showed you some of what the country's experiences are, which is that there is often a large disparity between the provinces or states or territories of a country, whether it is Mexico or Panama or Pakistan or Mozambique. And these give rise to, I think, 2 useful analytical techniques. One is following up on leaving no one behind. So you can look at all the regions in a first period and rank them from the least poor to the poorest. And then you see how fast they changed. What was their speed of poverty reduction? And it's a race to the bottom, so the fastest are doing the best in poverty reduction. And what you're wanting to look at is whether the poorest regions actually succeeded in reducing poverty the fastest. And a success story is the district of Musakel in Pakistan. Pakistan has nearly 200 districts. And this region managed to reduce MPI the fastest of any in the country. You can also do this exercise by ethnic groups or other disaggregated groups. But it's a good way of not only looking at the regional variation, but seeing if we're being able to close the gap or if horizontal inequalities are increasing. I think a second is that this can be, and this is much more textured and less in terms of the numbers, it can be useful information for people who are working in that region. Gonzalo Hernández Licona, who is the head of Coneval, the measurement group in Mexico, said that one of the unexpected benefits of releasing the MPI in Mexico is that the state-level governments received the numbers. And it was released, and they were released as an official permanent measure. But what was not expected was that then the states started coming very regularly to Coneval because they needed to get their poverty down. And they found out that at the state-level elections, they couldn't win unless they'd made visible progress on poverty. So the MPI became a tool which then got put into the census and now is updated every 5 years at the municipality level. And many countries are similarly doing census-level information to try to pass, again, many hands make light work, to try to pass information to the lowest levels of action so that they can take action appropriately. And so I think more than half of the countries with official national MPIs also have census-based MPIs. So the regional story that you painted in Tanzania could go, in a sense, even further. And so that local groups perhaps would also have the information that it would empower them to act in a different way. So I think those are my brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know we are running against the time. Very briefly, Dr. Chua, if you can highlight, as you know that since 2014, in Tanzania there have been several attempts, first through the Oxford Policy Management Institute and later through the Tanzania Human Development Reports 2014 and 2017 through the ESRF UNDP initiative to calculate MPI as an alternative measure of poverty. So could you please very briefly say what is happening or the process of officiating the MPI as an alternative measure of poverty in Tanzania?
Thanks so much. Let me start by saying that as we have seen the presentation, the role of the National Bureau of Statistics now in any country is to promote the culture of evidence-based and leave no one behind. And we will agree with me that the Sustainable Development Agenda is about leave no one behind. And goal number 1, target 1.2, indicator 1.2.2 is about to measure poverty in all dimensions. So before 2014, as you mentioned, Dr. Akida, that in Tanzania we were using the head count ratio, which has a lot of limitations though, okay? Because we measure our poverty really by consumption, monetary, and a little bit of assets ownership. Professor Mkenda knows this rather than I do. So the other aspect of deprivation we didn't capture much. So in 2014, and given the fact that we want to know the level for deprivation across the community, across the population, then we thought that at least we should start with the global MPI, which has 3 dimensions. Let me check that. No time is not with us. The education level, as the professor she has pointed out. Education, number of years in schooling, health and living standards, with 10 variables. So we started that, and we produced the reports in 2014. And the role of the National Bureau of Statistics was to avail the ESRIFD data, the official data from my office, to construct those. And now, currently, we are doing the 2017-18 household budget survey, and we have been engaging with my sister, Professor Sabina, a long time ago, when we were sitting under the IEG. IEG is the Interagency Expert Group for the Sustainable Development. This is the group that was devoted by United Nations to look at the 244 indicators that has to respond to the SDGs by 2030. And Tanzania is sitting there as the co-chair, saving the African continent. So we have been working very closely with Professor Sabina to see what really opportunities that Tanzania can get out of that. So based on that conversation with Professor Sabina, then what quickly we did for this household budget survey, which is in the field right now, is for us to have the national MPI. As she pointed out this morning, national MPI needs champion, needs political will. And for now in Tanzania, we have political will. This morning, I spoke with my minister that he was sitting here, and he was so excited to see Tanzania. We are also producing national MPI, which is okay. It will give us the level of deprivation across all the dimensions that we will select by involving different actors. Not just the National Bureau of Statistics to sit with the DPGs, with the development partners, no, is to call upon the partnership. I think this is the spirit that other countries that they are now producing national MPI, the participatory approach should be also applied here in Tanzania. So we will do so. But the process has to go very fast because we have data right now for 5 months sitting with us at the National Bureau of Statistics for the 2017-18. I know we are working very closely with the World Bank. Let me extend my sincere thanks to Madame Belabet, because we have technical assistance from the World Bank that we are working with them. So very quickly, we have developed the terms of reference, and also let me extend my sincere gratitude to the Embassy of Sweden. They have commissioned Oxford University to work closely with us, and of course ESRF and other partners in the national statistical system to work with the National Bureau of Statistics to come up with this MPI and the headcount ratio that we would like to have. So this is the process that we are currently working on it. But again, I'm sorry to say this, anything to be done. Thank you, Professor, from Professor Joseph. He has pointed out very clearly, mindset is number one. Mindset goes with political will. I'm sitting at the National Bureau of Statistics. We know data in action. We have seen these good numbers. We have seen the regional variations across the MPIs and GDPs and everything. We do produce these nice indicators. Are we promoting the culture of evidence-based? Do these numbers, the indicators, the nice indicators we are producing, how fast is going to be applied to improve the wealth, to improve the social well-being of our people? So change mindset is number one. Do we really like to encourage influx of people from rural areas to to come to Dar es Salaam. No, something has to be done. So the challenges, rather that I'm seeing, and for now I'm not seeing like a challenge. And number one is the debate across the globe about the MPI and so. But I know Madam Professor Sabina will sort out. Issue of cut-off points is issue of how to determine the dimensions that will go at the national, a number of indicators, variables, which variables should be, the weights, all these kind of things, then it will be solved. Other issues of leaving no one behind. I know in Tanzania we do have what we call decentralization by devolution at the district level. I know in my office we normally do our surveys and we aggregate information up to the regional level if we go further. And this is because of the sample sizes may not be enough to reach to the district level, but I know there are some techniques like small area estimation where you can apply this and then you have those information. But again, these are the estimates. But anyway, I know experts are available, and the professor, she's here, and she's accompanied by his groups, which I think we will work together. I would love to see these MPIs, for instance. I've seen Kilimanjaro, Kigoma, and so. I would love to see Kigoma, for instance, Kakonko. When we analyze the poverty mapping, in fact, it was a hot debate in the parliament. We saw one of the districts in Kigoma, for Kakonko, around 60% of the population lives below poverty line. And it was really a hot debate. Could you give us the reasons, what happens, what blah, blah? So could you carry out the qualitative study that will tell us the causes of this poverty, that Kakonko is ranking #1 out of 100 and something, 188 councils, Kakonkos. So if you could run the MPI up to that level, Madam Professor, and EHRF, then this is the level that we will love to see. And probably go further down, because at the constituency level, because these members for parliaments, they have been held accountable to their citizens. They would love to see the level for deprivation across the constituency level. So going that level is where really we would love to go. And this will be done through changing mindset. And of course, as I've pointed out, that the political will is already there, that the Ministry of Finance and Planning, where National Bureau of Statistics reports, hoping that the process will be championed in that way, and then it will go further as we move. But the issue here now is to foster partnership across the national statistical system, bringing together the private sector, bringing together civil society organizations to work together, because leave no one behind. It doesn't solely mean that the National Bureau of Statistics will produce these numbers and tell stories out of it, and in fact ensure what the government needs to do for their citizens. Then we need to bring more partners, as it is stipulated under the Sustainable Development Agenda, goal number 17, bringing partnership, governance, and so. So let me end there and leave to others to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chua. Now my last question goes to UNDP, to Mr. Abraham. UNDP has been for a long time using HDI as a standard multi-dimension measurement of human development. And it's recently, I think from 2014, you have officially adopted the MPI as additional measure at the global level. So what do you think are the relative merits of both measures, MPI and HDI? And also, how can they be useful in developing and shaping strategies and policies in a country?
Thank you for the presentation and other panelists for the detailed discussion. Yes, UNDP has been pioneering the Human Development Index through its several levels of reports. every year, UNDP headquarters has been producing a human development report selecting the most important and pressing themes that transcend the whole world, using the data collected by countries and by some international organizations to inspire countries to look into the human dimension of our development effort, using the approach of capabilities and creating opportunities. Through time, UNDP has learned a global report per se will not inspire countries. They should be able and supported to produce their own reports so that they will use it as policy instrument to indicate where the focus should be, where the resources should be allocated, and where they are found. As a result, countries has been producing reports intermittently. Some countries every other year, others every other or 4 or 5 years. And of recent, over the past, I think, 5 or 6 years, a regional report has been produced. The African Bureau, the UNDP African Bureau has produced so far about 3 regional reports. In all our effort, we have been partnering with MPI Oxford in analyzing some of the essential indicators and inputs to the Human Development Report. Much of the indicators in HDI are more or less the same as the MPI, except that they are more wider, because the equation for HDI is a continuous one. As of now, we have been using poverty, education and health indicators, but we can add the rights aspect of as well, the human rights, the rule of law, the governance, etc., except that the data is not easily obtained, and when it is obtained, it is bulky to analyze and costly. Otherwise, it adds. Now, the importance of the HDI being like that, the most pressing need from countries that emerge is to focus on poverty in many dimensions of it. As a result, UNDP also started to refocus based on the needs of the governments on multidimensional poverty. In a way, as we address the multidimensional poverty, we are creating human capabilities and increasing the indices. The indices can be prepared similar to the MPI at regional, but also at district level. We have few countries who have produced regional human development reports in Africa, like Nigeria and some other 2 countries. Therefore, there is a lot of complementarity between the MPI and the HDI. I can say MPI is a subsequent effort generated after the demand for HDI has increased. And like what I said, HDI is about enabling human capacities of countries, so that their development trajectory will be defined, cleared, and built. And that can only happen when the investment on poverty reducing and reducing inequality happens. Both are indices, but we have now more indices actually. We have indices for individual components. For example, the natural resource utilization indices that has been recently developed by UNDP Regional Bureau. We have also the social indices that has been developed by UNECA. So these are only indicators or showing countries where to focus or concentrate the efforts and the resources. They are all policy instruments. As of now, the focus of UNDP, in addition to both, is on the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, where governments have asked to achieve by 2030. And all of these are dependent on the effort of the statistical offices and the academia and the research institutions. The main role of UNDP is to facilitate and organize the thoughts of the knowledge that we have in our hands and located in different locations, whether as an individual or institution. The future of these reports is actually to be handed over to national institutions like ASRF, who have done the work for some time, and to refocus for other new initiatives. We will not, or we are not, as UNDP, interested to stick forever on certain reports and indices. As countries develop and evolve, agendas change, UNDP takes also the lead to facilitate those thoughts. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abraha, and all the panelists. Now it's time for reflections and questions. Unfortunately, we have really run out of time, so I'll take only 3 interventions, one from this side and then one from the middle, and the other one from this side. And then we'll hear very briefly from the panelists, and then we'll have to close the session. Yes, anyone from that side?
Going once, going twice.
Yes, this side. Any question? Yes, there is a hand here.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I just wanted to ask a question on the first set of charts that were shown. That was really interesting, very insightful. The one question I have is, we saw Dar es Salaam is an outlier in most cases, and you said that the dependency ratio is very low in Dar es Salaam. That was one of the reasons why it's showing higher development. The question I have is, there are a lot of people who are coming into Dar es Salaam, and these are the young people who are coming, working in Dar es Salaam, which was the reason why the band is the way it is. But they must be sending money back home from where they're coming. So in terms of the remittances, have you looked at how that impacts really the remittances that go out from these people? While it shows the low dependency ratio, the dependency ratio, they're not supporting dependents in Dar es Salaam, but they may be supporting dependents from where they're coming from. So what impact does that have? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you can mention your beautiful name and the institution you're coming from.
So my name is Preeti Arora, and I'm from the World Bank based in Washington.
Thank you. Any other?
Gender balance. Where are the men?
Yes. Yes, Professor
Oh, okay.
Wangwe. And then we'll have the last one from FSDT.
Yes, I'm impressed by the way a country used MPI for political purposes, determining votes for that reason. I think that's a more important pressure in making countries address poverty. In Tanzania, as Dr. Chua mentioned, but not very explicitly, politically it's the opposite. People are resisting for this information to come out. And it's possible that those who are resisting are the members of parliament who see that the implication of these figures in their constituency could paint a negative picture on them. So they need pressure from outside themselves to say this must be accepted and you must perform to show that you have impacted on MPI. It's not your choice to say you accept or you don't accept. It's your choice to strategize on how to reduce poverty. So maybe the question I would ask is, what do you experience, Sabina, in other countries on how they have gone about going beyond those who are interested parties so that they don't prevent the outcome from being an important indicator? And secondly, how ranking between different localities in terms of MPI actually produces peer pressure on performing, because I think that would be a positive way of making countries address the right issues if we have to address poverty.
Thank you. The last intervention.
Thank you. My name is Sostenes Kewe. I work for the Financial Sector Review Trust. My question is about the household budget survey. I'm more interested in when exactly it will be out, so that we can really do this deep dive analysis and then understand, the course of action that need to be taken. The other question has been asked, so I had to, but he's already covered that.
Thank you very much. We have 3 questions, one for Mark, 2 I think for Sabina, and the last one for Dr. Chua. So if you can have 1 minute each, and then lastly, UNDP will give the final reflection. Mark.
I just wanted to comment briefly on the this issue about the nature of both to do with data and with what is happening. It was mentioned earlier today about the size of the informal sector, which is very high in Tanzania. The problem is that actually, in many ways, little is known about it. That's a problem. So you get, and what it often leads to generalizations being made, which I don't think are always true. Kind of like, for example, in rural areas, if you look at existing statistics, a large majority of the population seem to be rural producers. I think in the statistics there is a confusion between an attachment to the land and being an agriculture producer. A lot of people in the rural areas have continued attachment to land, but are not necessarily actively engaged in rural production. So in agriculture production, for example, it's very hard to find in the statistics the enormous employment in the informal mining sector. If you take the statistics on employment, for example, if you take primary employment, you find it very little. If you go to secondary employment, you find it to be very high. But when the aggregation happens, it's only the primary that gets aggregated because you want to avoid double counting. Now there is problems with that, because if you look at field work that's being done, say, on informal mining, these informal miners are full-time busy with mining. They're not involved in the thing, yet they're often classified. Also, they're classified as self-employed, while actually most of them are wage-employed, although the conditions of wage employment are very different. So there's a whole range of things that need to be better understood. The same with Dar es Salaam. I think there's a vast influx of youth which cannot be absorbed by the existing formal labor. That is quite clear. So a lot of the activity is informal. I think if you look at productivity in Dar es Salaam, it's kind of like Dar es Salaam itself is a dual economy. Coexisting of a sector which is quite highly productive, and next to it a sector which is of various level of productivity, and absorbing people, whether it's from street vendors to roadside producers or whatever else, up to kind of small and medium enterprises. It's that large variety of which, in many ways, a lot of data is lacking. That's a problem.
Thank you so much. I'll be brief. So, first of all, the first question was about people who might be reluctant to use the MPI and be held accountable to it. And here I think if it's come out as an official statistic regularly issued and reliably issued by a National Statistics Institute, then the question is how to take the news. And there may be external shocks of a natural disaster or But what is different about the MPI from a monetary poverty measure is it's a little bit more predictable in that there's volatility in a monetary measure which comes from exchange rates, or it comes from macro shocks, or it comes from inflation. And so it makes it a little bit less predictable at the lower levels of disaggregation. But the MPI is more based on services, and so in a sense more accurately reflects what's been going on, particularly in that region. And so I think what can be useful is just to celebrate cases of success without pointing fingers for a while at the other cases, but celebrate the leaders, the pioneers, who are the trendsetters in reducing it faster. And countries have done that through the media, through newspapers, and putting case studies out of, in Brazil, the fastest state, or whatever, to incentivize others. And in terms of peer pressure of a global MPI, it is true, I must say. You know, we just work on the measurement, but as soon as you arrive somewhere, they're like, well, what's my neighbor doing? And how did it go down? And there's this competitiveness, and if that can be harnessed, that's fantastic. I think that's one of the values of an MPI, is that it goes subnational, which $1.90 cannot. And so there have been a doctoral thesis on Punjab, India versus Punjab, Pakistan, another doctoral thesis on West Bengal in India versus Bangladesh. So these, the north of Nigeria and Niger, another book actually on that. So these are quite interesting sometimes to people who know the wider political context, policy context, poverty context, to analyze what happens across borders.
Thank you, Sabina. Dr. Chua.
Yeah, thank you so much. To respond to Mr. Gewe's data be available is the